In recent days, the militant group Hamas issued a firm statement. It will not surrender its weapons until an independent Palestinian state is recognized, with Jerusalem as its capital. This declaration marks a new turning point in the long and turbulent conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Hamas's refusal to disarm clashes directly with Israel's demands for demilitarization as a condition for peace. The backdrop to this conflict is decades-long and deeply complex. Since taking control of Gaza in 2007, Hamas has maintained both political authority and military resistance. While it has participated in indirect ceasefire negotiations mediated by Egypt and Qatar, these talks have repeatedly failed to bridge core differences. The most recent attempt involved proposals for a 60-day ceasefire and hostage exchange, but discussions collapsed, largely because Hamas insisted on its right to armed resistance unless Palestinian statehood was guaranteed. Israel, led by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, remains firm in its position that Hamas must disarm completely before any long-term agreement. Netanyahu argues that an armed Hamas cannot be part of the political future in Gaza, viewing it instead as a perpetual security threat. He has also criticized efforts by countries like the UK and Canada to recognize a Palestinian state, claiming such moves reward terrorism. Hamas frames its position as a matter of self-determination and national rights. In its statement, the group reaffirmed that its armed resistance cannot be relinquished until Palestinians gain full sovereignty. That includes an independent state with Jerusalem as its capital, free from Israeli military control. From Hamas's perspective, disarming without statehood would mean relinquishing its claim to resistance and sovereignty, a price it is unwilling to pay. The conflict that brought Hamas to power began in October 2023, when militants stormed into southern Israel, killing over 1,200 people and taking more than 250 hostages. Israel's subsequent military operations in Gaza unleashed widespread destruction, killing tens of thousands, mostly civilians, and creating a devastating humanitarian crisis. Since that escalation, indirect negotiations have involved mediators like France, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Qatar. A plan endorsed by multiple nations called for Hamas to disarm and hand control of Gaza over to the Palestinian Authority under international supervision. Israel rejected the proposal, insisting it cannot tolerate a return of Hamas influence in any form. Hamas's refusal to disarm without statehood adds a new dimension to the ongoing diplomatic impasse. It draws a red line in the sand. Peace is not negotiable at the cost of Palestinian national rights. The demand for recognizing Jerusalem as their capital is particularly significant. Challenges Israel's exclusive claims over the city and resonates deeply across the Palestinian population. On the ground in Gaza, the situation remains dire. Food insecurity has worsened, with thousands dying of malnutrition near aid distribution sites. Israeli airstrikes continue, and civilians seeking assistance face lethal risks. Gaza's humanitarian infrastructure is severely strained, and international condemnation is mounting. Efforts to deliver aid have been marred by violence, with reports of dozens killed while seeking assistance at the same time U.S. envoy visits aimed at improving aid delivery have been criticized as ineffectual or even staged. Hamas dismissed some appearances as propaganda stunts, arguing that real change requires political transformation, not temporary relief. The broader international context is shifting too. The UK, following France and other nations, has announced plans to officially recognize Palestinian statehood unless Israel agrees to a ceasefire and peace framework. This global diplomatic shift underscores growing frustration with Israel's military strategy and support for two-state solution models. Critics of state recognition warn that it may embolden Hamas. Hostage families and victim advocacy groups fear such gestures could remove incentives for Hamas to negotiate prisoner releases. They argue that diplomatic recognition without tangible concessions may leave hostages in prison longer and worsen suffering. Meanwhile, Hamas's alliance with Fatah remains fragile. The group's refusal to disarm without political gains exacerbates internal divisions. Fatah, which governs parts of the West Bank, has publicly criticized Hamas and pushed for unified Palestinian leadership under the Palestinian Authority. But Hamas remains unwilling to cede control unless its conditions primarily state recognition are met. The Beijing Declaration of mid-2024, which brought together multiple Palestinian factions, aimed to reconcile Hamas and Fatah under a unified vision. That agreement reaffirmed the Palestinian demand for statehood and laid the groundwork for a transitional government. But with war raging and hostilities unresolved, implementation remains stalled. Analysts emphasize the symbolic power of Hamas's stance. By linking disarmament explicitly to statehood, the group challenges the prevailing international narrative that security must precede sovereignty. It asserts that Palestinian rights must form the basis for peace, not the other way around. At the same time, Israel views this position as non-negotiable. Netanyahu has rejected frameworks that allow Hamas to remain armed even under nominal Palestinian authority. He argues that such arrangements would threaten Israel's long-term security. The impasse means diplomatic agreements remain out of reach. The military and humanitarian toll in Gaza continues to climb. Over 60,000 people have died since the conflict began. Aid efforts struggle under blockade and obstruction. International pressure for humanitarian corridors, ceasefire, and reconstruction is mounting. But real change remains elusive without political resolution. Within Gaza, Hamas propaganda portrays its armed resistance as a necessary countermeasure to Israeli occupation. It uses nationalistic imagery and messaging tied to statehood and sovereignty. Supporters see the group as defending Palestinian identity and rights in the face of overwhelming force. Detractors call it a scar on Gaza's future, arguing that armed rule leads to international isolation and internal hardship. The growing trend toward international recognition of Palestine, led by European and Arab nations, signals a potential shift in diplomatic balance. Israel sees this as a direct challenge, arguing that recognition without peace or demilitarization legitimizes Hamas. Hamas, conversely, sees recognition as confirmation that its demands resonate globally. Ultimately, the road ahead remains long and uncertain. Without mutual concessions, peace remains elusive. Hamas insists that disarmament cannot precede statehood. Israel insists the opposite. Till those terms intersect, negotiations remain deadlocked. In the meantime, the humanitarian crisis worsens.